was terrific. Mario, remember, you have to be the mediator.
Okay.
Yeah, you should sit here.
No,
Come on.
Here, sit back down. Here, just stay here.
Okay.
So who's that? Is that Scott on your right?
Okay.
What are we doing?
We're listening to
Whose
Greg.
hand is that on your right? Is that Scott?
Oh, yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Scott. And I see Eka. Who else is up there?
Yeah, here.
Serbia. We're in Belgrade.
Move them around.
Oh, this is Eka.
There's
Hey,
Peter,
Mario.
Scott, Ingeborg.
We just had a very engaged. We just talked to Alejandro in Princeton. It was
Oh,
good.
nice.
It was good.
Yeah, but not on the digital. You're supposed to bring us the digital as you see it from your exhibition and the future of where the work is going to be, robots, whatever.
And Peter's project. You got it?
We're
No.
working on a robot here right now.
You don't have to link it to me at all, because I don't want to be part of that.
Well, you know my theory. You started some of the problem.
We're going to ask you some questions, though, Greg. But go ahead.
All right, man.
Go ahead.
Do your thing, whatever it is.
Okay, well, I mean, Peter and I had a nice conversation in Canada, and it's my belief that Peter actually is one of our earliest computers.
Yeah.
That his interest in procedural design, I mean, Bob Somel and other people characterize it in all kinds of ways, but I believe a procedural approach where you can rewind and replay design decisions ad infinitum is inherently algorithmic. And so in the earliest projects, especially the Frankfurt Biocenter, it wasn't so much an interest in the computer for geometry, but actually an interest in the computer for algorithm, process, and I really believe something that's procedural, that you can make a decision, you can then rewind back to 3 or 4 design steps and redo the design process over and over again, which is something Peter was doing long before there was a computer design tool. So for me, I think the conversation, I would just distinguish between geometry and procedure. And I believe what's more relevant to a discussion of Peter's work is really proceduralism and algorithm, rather than, let's say, spline or surface or, digital tectonics.
Greg, I have a question. I mean, if I may say, sure, we can read his work as a kind of premonition of the obsession with procedure. But actually, I don't think that's what it was. I mean, I think if you look at the L and the project you're talking about now, all of the houses, but also the Frankfurt, it was about the idea that we would read into form a possible process, and that this was an artificial process. It was a mental construct, and it was the dialectic between it as a mental construct and an actual object. It was always that dialectic and an implicit narrative development, not the actualization of a procedure that he was really interested in. That kind of proceduralism is the interpretation of his students like you and other people who took it into a much more mechanized, kind of production of objects, literally, and he was never interested in making anything. It was always about reading and interpreting, the act of interpretation. The procedure was kind of a physicalization of interpretive acts.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with procedure the way you're talking about it. You took it that way. Somebody could say you hijacked it as a kind of intellectual project for your own ends to make it sort of, I could say, legitimize a kind of mechanized proceduralism. But that's not what it is at all. And, I could hijack it in another direction, but, I think what really mattered about it was the reading idea, was the interpretation.
No, I'm not so sure. All I'm saying is that if the gesture of the architect and the design method of the architect was primarily, let's say, aesthetic, historical, you know, in the sense of being referential. Peter's work in the 70s and 80s was to break away from the singular gesture and come up with a gesture that was, you know, let's say, much more open, in the sense that you could take it in a lot of different directions. So, House 10, I don't really think there's one House 10. There's a process, and there's a procedure, and you could freeze that in a lot of different ways to think about what House 10 is.
Yeah.
We could have debates about which is the best iteration of it. And that's, to me, why a certain kind of digital architecture went in the direction it went. It's because that was the precursor to it. I mean, if you're insinuating a certain kind of parametricism or something is procedural, yeah, sure, I agree, Peter's work has nothing to do with that. But I think he was looking for a kind of a signature which was very much in line with digital process. You know, it's a signature. It's like now a Formula One car. It's not designed by anybody. You know, it's designed by a whole team of people that are doing procedural analysis. There's no author there. Peter was very interested in that project of not being the author that makes the gesture, but being the author that makes the process. And I think you can't say that wasn't a premonition of the
I think
digital.
you're right. I mean, I do see it. I know what you mean, but I think finally that he makes an object and that we read that it is coming into being, iterating, is another object in any of its other variations.
Yeah.
Is more important than the actual procedure. That's all. But you're right. And
But it would be
that's
worth
something-
asking the question, because I agree with you that there is an implicit invitation to read, for sure. And it might be just worth us asking as a panel, is something like, let's say, Guardiola House more legible than Frankfurt Biocentrum? Or does it invite reading differently? The projects which were just right at the edge of the digital and the ones that became digital, you know, is there a legibility difference there? Or would you need a computer to read Biocentrum?
Well, the L, the houses that were made of the L, are in a way already machines for reading. They are what you're asking, what you're talking about, and they're reading and readable.
Yep.
I think, Scott,
Yep.
I would take it like the Turing machine. You know, in a way, it's reading and writing at the same time because
Which one?
It's the Turing machine. The Turing machine
Yep.
is the principle of computation.
Yeah.
So it is a reading. It's reading and writing at the same time, and I think that's what, for me, Peter's work does. And not to fetishize the process, but it's all about the reading and rewriting. And you see this in the Find Out House in particular, where there's this, I call it a cooking recipe, where you know you have, this is like the algorithm in a way, which gives you certain inclinations how to read what, and then there are the color changes, there are the texture changes, etc. And for me, that's exactly what I think Greg is alluding to as an early stage of analog computing, if
Yep.
you want, but it's a logic of computation in a way.
Yep.
So without Peter necessarily being aware of it, but it's a principle of it which we take on from our generation and do something with it.
Mario Carpo is going to say something. I want to add one thing, that Palladio clearly was not interested in procedure or process. I've, in a sense, forced procedure and process onto Palladio, number one. Computer people have tried, like Bill Mitchell and others have tried to say, we can make 100 different Palladian iterations out of the typologies of Palladian space. And they're not one of them are what Palladio did. In other words, the computer cannot, through these iterations, ever reproduce the processes or what Palladio was about, as far as I'm concerned.
What these people were doing was shape grammars. Can you hear me?
Come on, you get up here.
Come over here.
Come here, this is Mario.
Mario's.
Oh,
Yeah,
where? Here?
yeah. Can you see Mario?
Hi. No, I'm too close.
Back up a little.
Yeah.
Here.
There you go. Here. There.
Now you can,
That's okay.
That's all right. Go ahead.
You're talking now. Lean over.
it's a bit of a strange
Can't see you.
configuration.
matter.
No, go ahead.
Go.
You see the little
Talk.
image, Mario?
Okay. What Bill Mitchell and other people were doing, which was shape grammars, it's a well-known procedure of the 70s. This is what computers could do at the time. It has a logic which is steeped in the spirit of that time. But going back to what Greg was saying, the connection between Peter's design process and that early cybernetic approach to computer-aided design with computers as a tool for decision making, which it is legitimate, it can be reconstructed historically and even historiographically, because it was again in the spirit of the time. But historically speaking, the real conflation between the computer as a tool and form making is the story which we know, which happened a bit later and which has as protagonists Peter and you. This was then when the real Big Bang happened, and when computers started to be actually used to make form, and incidentally to try and make space. And this started to happen in the early 90s. What happened in the 70s and 80s is something which historians and scholars would now be happy to reconstruct with an approach which is indeed archaeological, the term is pertinent, but if we want to go back and see the point in time when the computer as a tool started to actually create new shapes, a new form, to be embedded in and sustained by a new theory. This happened in 92, 93, 94. And the protagonists were not the cybernetic guys of the 70s and 80s. The protagonists were the two of you in 1992, 1993, for better, for worse.
Well, I agree. There's a very different project for a historian and let's say a designer right now to think about computers. But just because we've got Peter, I'd kind of like to know a little bit about the role of people like Christopher Alexander and all those shape grammar people. Because it's funny, they show up with Frank Gehry, who was really looking for the formal potential or the aesthetic gesture possible with computers. And they show up with Peter in terms of the computer facilitating, what I would call procedural. I'm sure there's a better word for it, but some kind of process-based approach. And I know there were debates, but for Peter, what's the status of those people in your mind now? What's your recollection of them?
Well, first of all, you bring up one of my nemesis, Christopher Alexander, and that's well documented. I mean, there's no question that the first inspiration I ever had in architecture was to respond to Alexander's book, which was published in 1960, Notes on a Synthesis of Form. And my dissertation was not against Colin Rowe or against English empiricism. It was against Chris Alexander, who wrote his PhD partly in Cambridge and partly at Harvard. So Chris Alexander, the well-recorded debate that we had at Harvard is, and the same goes for Sim van der Rijn and others in the school of Chris Alexander, I had really nothing but an antipathy for their work. So whether Frank was for it or against it, I can't believe Frank and Chris Alexander had any allegiance at all. But
I was thinking
This is not the digital you were ever interested in.
not.
Peter, could one say maybe that subconsciously, let me just put it subconsciously, I think maybe Greg is out for that as well a bit, that you looked at Alexander's work, you were totally opposed to it because it was totally the antithesis, and yet you were also, of course, intrigued because it was quite a splash back then, and you said, damn it, how can I fix my problem here? Okay, I'm working this through in my way,
Right.
inspired by my teacher, Colin Rowe. but of course also slightly positional to the him, and work it my way. So that, of course, would have then, because if you look at the Alexander flow charts and all that, there is somehow a slight recollection, sorry that we think that way, but there is something which suggests now that you turned it actually into the autonomous project of architecture and utilize architecture and its base elements to run the program through, like Alexander, who of course had zero understanding of how he would ever possibly appropriate to architecture what he was doing. You know, and I think that's subconsciously perhaps running in your scheme.
I don't disagree.
But let me put it perhaps more brutally. The cybernetic approach, the use of computing as an aid to decision making in the 70s was tried and failed. It did not change the history of architecture. It did not make the history of architecture. It is a footnote in the history books. Whereas the use of computing tools as a tool for making form in the 90s, it was tried, and it succeeded so stupendously, but we are still part of it. I mean, one is the story of the failure, and the second one is the story of a success. For better, for worse, in historical terms, we can already ascertain that.
No, I think it's just important to say that one group, like Peter was saying, was looking at expert systems, like trying to redo Palladio or make a digital Palladio, or vernacular systems, which is Christopher Alexander, where you're right, in the 90s, these were designers that were looking at this as a medium, you know, more as a tool. I mean, like you would look at a compass. So there's a huge difference between those two projects. But I do think that it had to have pushed in a direction that Christopher Alexander was doing what he was doing with vernacular architecture. I also just wonder, at the time, his interest in the computer, did that put you off of it? I mean, if Christopher Alexander was talking about computers back then, I know I personally would have thought, I don't want to go towards computers because I'm not interested in this vernacular stuff.
I didn't know that Christopher Alexander honestly was talking about computers. And the first, you know, you and I know where the first interest in computers came when I was teaching at Ohio State. And we had to deal with the Wexner Center. And I told Chris Yesios, we need some kind of tool to model space, which we didn't have. And we were sending stuff back and forth every day, and Chris was, Form Z was a response to us, not us to Form Z, for sure. Okay, Chris didn't know what he was doing, and we were just telling him what to do, and we didn't have the expertise to write the algorithms that he had, okay? So he wrote the algorithms and would adjust them daily or weekly to fit what we needed.
And that was the success story, form making, not decision making.
That wasn't decision. Greg would tell you. I think it's form making.
But I think the difference, I mean, and we're talking about fine differences here, but I think differences are important. Peter, you didn't say, okay, everybody get a computer, let's start making shapes.
No.
You said, here's a 8.5 by 11 ridiculous diagram of DNA sequences.
Yeah.
Let's now use the computer to iterate. And I just think there's a big difference between making shapes and making whatever you want to call that thing, a base plan or a sequence, a formal sequence.
But since you were involved in it, we were not interested in making shapes. We were interested in trying to make the DNA chain conform to a possible architectural thing which no one could read. In other words, there's no reading of that. That was the really important thing. We tried to make a building that we knew conformed to a set of rules that no one else could read.
And were you trying to do that with the houses too?
No, the houses have nothing to do, no. Let's not go back to the houses. Because the houses are a completely different thing.
Were those supposed to be legible?
I didn't think so, Peter.
No.
They also stymied the reader. You stymied the reader also
Yeah.
in those houses. House 10, it's all about stymieing the reader.
Well, the question is, when we go to the build, let's go to Cincinnati. Do you think anybody, because you work there, can read Cincinnati? No way. No way. No, but you know what's interesting? There is a sensorial being, there is an affective condition that exists in Cincinnati, it exists in the Wexner, it exists in the Holocaust Project, it exists in Santiago, which has nothing to do with this other inability to read or reading. They're two different conditions, I would argue. You could look at I mean, you walk into the space in Cincinnati and it's still a wow space, but it also something else. And that's what I think differentiates, let's say, Frank Gehry's Bilbao with Cincinnati, for example. I think there's more of a wow in Frank Gehry. You walk in, wow, and then you go away and say, well, that's it. The wow in Cincinnati is something tangential to another condition that no one can understand, really.
Greg, can I ask Greg something?
Sure, please.
Greg, you know, Peter just rehearsed something which I hadn't really heard it was about the Wexner. He said that he needed something to happen in the Wexner, and then Yesios had to, you know, sort of find a way toward that. In other words, it was an idea of Peter's that led the technique of manifesting. Do you believe there's any room for that today? Do you believe anyone could have an idea that would require the instruments of its realization, rather than the other way, which I think you're more likely to speak for, which is that the instruments are determinative of what we do today? Is there any role for the other direction of working, where you start with something that's not yet defined instrumentally? And invent the instrument for it? Invent the instrument for it? No, wait, let him, I want to know what he thinks of that.
Sure. I mean, I think we've gone through a process of, I mean, Sylvia calls it mop-up work, but there's been a lot of digital mop-up work over the last 20 years. And I think there's probably another 20 years of mop-up work where certain paradigms get set and then other people try to figure out what to do with them, how to evaluate them, how to, you know, be critical of them. But I think there's still a lot of room. I mean, my interest in things that move, it's really about trying to figure out what that would be, like what literal and phenomenal motion would be, and then figure out where the digital plugs into it. I think there's a lot of space for people to have a concept and then address the digital in terms of manifesting that concept or instrumentalizing it. So yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think let's not valorize Peter too much, because there was a second thing I wanted to talk about, which is where curves came from. Because I think it's very interesting that in Biocentrum there was this chevron, and then in Carnegie Mellon, Cincinnati, Convention Center, curves started to happen. And then I remember the Staten Island project specifically was really curvaceous and actually more like a surface. And I just wondered, is that something that came with the digital, or is that something that predated it? Because I think the Wexner was a project that broke away from being centripetal or centroidal. It was a field project. And then Cincinnati and the projects, well, I would say the projects that came after Carnegie Mellon became like zippers, you know, somehow like strings or something, frames that work in an axis, like a curved axis. So Peter, was that something you saw in the digital, or is that something that...
No, I would argue, Greg, where it comes from is, and I was saying this morning here, it comes from Le Corbusier's drawing of the Parthenon, where you have the vertical elements, the grid, the sea, which is the horizontal elements, and the mountains, which you can't see other than in that drawing. which is the figural nature. And what one was always striving to do is to return the figural in some way to the grid. It had nothing to do with whether the computer could do it or not. And eventually, we became able to return the figural within the grid. And you could argue that part of that nascent figural is in Carnegie Mellon, and goes on in any number of ways later.
But Peter, can I ask
That's
you a
a
question?
real, figure grid debate. I see it in Zaha's work, I see it, that seems to be a really big, unresolved discussion right now.
Yeah, I would.
Parametricism is all about the figure of the grid.
No, I don't think there's any grid left in. There's no grid left in parametricism. It's all figure.
No.
No, yeah.
Well, look at Norman Foster's circuit. That's the granddaddy of parametricism. And, that's figure grid.
In your mind.
Grid cucumber.
There's no grid.
No, there's no grid in that.
It's all figure.
No, it's all figure.
It's a diagrid. It's a diagonally gridded pickle, or whatever they call it.
But it's a smooth surface.
Yeah, it is a smooth surface. Ingeborg has a...
I have one question for you, Peter, because I think you give a little too few credits to the imagery and therefore the imaginary which you received by looking at things which came out of the computer. And I'm not saying that to fetishize the tool at all, but I think there is a clear feedback loop between that what can be produced, but also what you visually take in. Even if you don't manipulate yourself, I think there is a lot of inspiration coming just from wireframes, motion sweeps, and things like that you just see, or even the triangulations we talked earlier about. So, and I think there is, right now I know you want to bring home very strongly the disciplinary and the refocus on the autonomy, but I think you need a little bit more credit also on this other side of the plate, which I don't think is harming the project at all, the disciplinary, because it takes still a disciplined, let's say, architect to look into that which you see and be triggered in a certain manner. And I think that's where the trick is lying, in fact. And the other question which Scott had, that how do we now actively shape our tools? I think that's why the entire scripting crowd came along, who started to script their own tools in a way because they couldn't deal or they didn't find that what they wanted to do within the pre-given software. So, and now Greg, on the other hand, deals right now with complexities which, none of us could possibly ever script along, because that's something where, you have real physical modeling going on, which is extremely complex and is done by specialists, of
But
course.
he also, Greg, is unique among us because he also has a disciplinary background, very finely tuned, and so
Right.
that he has the capacity to do scripting, whereas a senior at Princeton as a thesis cannot do scripting as far as I'm concerned, because they don't have the disciplinary tools to deal with those kinds of things. I don't know what you feel about it, Greg.
Well, there's a meta-narrative that the digital technologies came from somewhere else. And a little bit of that is true. We were with one of the founders of AutoCAD, and he was saying that they never thought to put dimensions in it. That it was 2 years in, and the architect said, could you do dimensions? And they said, well, why would you need dimensions? So it's not like that stuff became pre-cooked and then everybody tried to figure out what to do with it. It's really that people asked for certain things and the digital responded in specific ways. But a gift like that never comes without its own influence. And so I'm also interested in what those influences are. And this whole thing about the figure, to me, it's really interesting because you, Peter especially, was looking for a new kind of author before the digital, found in the digital the possibilities for this new kind of authorship where maybe things were even more rational and less legible. Mm-hmm. But then there's some other stuff that comes with it, which to me is easy figuration. So because there's a kind of easy figure that comes with the digital as well. And I'm just wondering how you read figure 20 years later now.
Well, I would argue the Pickle is a great example of easy figuration, which is not where we want to be. And 100 years from now, the Pickle will be gone. I'm sorry. No, because it won't survive. It just won't. And we're talking about figuration that is far more complex, that that's what you're dealing with in the kinds of things, for example, that you're interested in. And whether it's in boats or jewelry or, architecture, the figuration that you are about is what I would call the introduction of heterogeneous space into a computational system that is set up to produce that kind of heterogeneity as opposed to homogeneous surfaces. And I would argue that you're one of the few people that has broken away from the homogeneous surface project into what I would consider heterogeneous space.
Yeah, well, and I think the discourse around digital technology is now that it's a rationalizing machine. It's a machine that can rationalize heterogeneous things. It's not really
Right.
so
Inconsistent.
much involved in their authorship.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
by the way, we discussed at length spline modelers earlier today.
Right.
Since we were asking where is the point of inflection when the tool starts to interact with what Peter was doing around that time and when the curve starts to emerge. It is a story which has you as a protagonist, so you probably know more or less how that happened. But in more general terms, to reconcile several things we have been saying, it is not so much a matter of an unconscious attitude. There is a historicity of techno-cultural change. It's not that a tool becomes available and people start to use it. If a tool becomes available, it is because there is a pre-existing desire to use it. If we invent a refrigerator and we start to sell it at the North Pole, no one will buy it. If we invent a spline modeler and we give it to Mies van der Rohe, the invention will not register in the history books. But at that point in time, when spline modelers ended up on your desks, they changed the history of architectural form. So it's not just the availability of the tool, it's that they were just the right answer to what you were doing at the time. And when they were available, you were more than eager, perhaps you more than Peter, to use it. And then there was a question earlier today by Scott saying, at what point in time was Peter indeed making digital figuration? Which at some point he was. Which perhaps today you're not very happy about.
No, I'm not unhappy. I mean, Greg knows more about that because it began in the moment that you were in the office and just after you left. Wouldn't you say? I mean, that was a crucial moment it was at Emory and other projects that were moving at the time.
Well, and I remember, when I first saw Wexner as a student, being shocked, like not knowing what to do with the armory, which is in a funny way like a 3D print of the armory or something.
Yeah.
It's like a facsimile of a building is integrated into the building. And there were some projects like I don't even know if you remember, but the Boston Port project.
Yes.
It was kind of all figure. Like it was like Biocentrum, only the figures were more complex and they were scaled and iterated in a way. But that kind of palimpsest work, which was trying to solve figure grid more by duplicating and scaling, was super interesting. And I think it introduced, I think that's where the curves came in.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's Richard Meyer and Michael Graves, and they were all itching for splines. It's funny that they never went towards digital technology for them. I mean, Michael was onto something else, but it's funny that Richard never connected with that. I mean, could have actually been really interesting.
You said fishing for splines. Is
that fishing?
Did you say fishing for
Itching,
splines?
itching.
But I would say fishing for splines.
Well, because I remember in Princeton,
It's what we were
I don't know who had them, but everybody had these German splines. They were these rubber tubes that had little discs at a regular interval, and you'd use them instead of French curves. And I was a hardcore compass person. You know, I liked Michael Graves, Hanselman era radial compound curves. And I thought the splines were like, you know, heresy. And then I started using MicroStation, which was the only spline modeler, and I realized, wow, you can bridge the digital analog thing here. But I remember seeing all the Meyer curves, and those were all French curves. They weren't all done with the compass. So that's real spline, I don't know, premonition of it. It's funny that Peter of the five is the only one that went into digital. Because it seems like the five architects, almost all of them, were looking at certain kinds of proto-digital techniques.
But wait, just a footnote. Earlier
I mean,
today...
Peter,
Oh, okay,
were you
speak.
surprised that Graves never picked up a computer?
I didn't hear what he said.
No,
Are you
but was
surprised
it-
that Graves didn't pick up a computer?
No,
No.
no. Graves was an artist.
Why?
Graves was an
cartoonist.
artist, a painter.
Artist.
He was a painter. He wasn't an architect, he was a painter. Maybe Richard
And
could have.
oh, what about Meyer?
Yeah, he thinks Meyer could have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Yeah, why not?
Don't forget Greg Lynn, because you brought up Michael Graves. I will bring up my favorite story. When I asked Michael Graves if I should hire you, he said, Greg Lynn is the worst student I've ever had. Okay? And so, why are you surprised?
But then, Greg, you know, now you have to add the story that Michael Graves has denied that you were ever his student.
Yeah, he claims I was never a student, so I've been downgraded from worst to.
It's even more.
Go ahead.
No, but talking about fishing for splines, since I made that this expression, earlier today I showed two slides of your stranded Sears towers. One is a maquette, which was made by hand, and one is a drawing, which is now being shown at the Art Institute in Chicago. There is an exhibition there. And it's the drawing which was published in AD. And I claim that it was all made by hand. Is that true? Now that is what I would call fishing for splines.
Well, no, I had already, that was after I'd worked for Peter for 5 years. And just as a total exercise, I just wanted to make the last drawing of my life. And that exhibition, I was locked in this horrible apartment Bob Somel found for me, and I had nothing else to do. So I just spent 2 months making drawings. And then I put my rapidographs in a box, and I never touched another ink on Mylar again. But it was a kind of perverse exercise in drafting. I knew it was the last thing I'd ever draft, because I already knew what you could do with the computer.
Yeah.
Greg, recently, if I may turn something to your work, your recent work that you showed, Greg did a great talk at MIT. He really showed us the new projects. Do you believe that the computational investigation you've done finally culminates, let's say, when you talk about movement, which was implicit in Peter but actualized by you, finally culminates in recognizing that, let's say, boats move and that buildings don't finally in the end? I mean, you've now finally, you've allowed yourself to design what really moves. I mean, earlier you would say something like Corbusier, the building is like a boat, it should move. Why shouldn't buildings move? But now you're making the things that do, boats.
Yeah. But I also think there's a lot of action
It makes sense.
looking at buildings that move. I mean, it's funny,
Still believes in it.
Rem especially. I mean, who would think Rem Koolhaas would be making so many buildings that are rolling around? And I mean, Jeff Kipnis showed me this 1980s project in Japan for a building with a moving auditorium in it.
But don't you think that's a minor idiomatic response? It's not really paradigmatic. You don't really believe that there will be a widely applicable, generalized
I'm a minor
response.
idiosyncratic person.
No, but I'm just
more
curious.
interested in the outliers than the mainstream. So yeah, you're
Okay.
right, but I think a big moving building will be idiosyncratic and marginal, but it will move the center.
But Greg, do we need to be
Okay.
so literal? I wonder, because I mean, I was personally very intrigued by the material research you do, and we had a discussion about your project, of course, already before you came online, and so the discussion was on how far you actually contribute to the discipline through what you currently do, or whether this is rather industrial design or whatever we want to call it. And so I wonder, how would you position that yourself? How would you position your work currently, and how would you see it being having an impact on the discipline?
On the architecture.
Yeah, on
On
the
the
architecture, we
architecture
call it So I compared it a little bit with the, early modern, in a way when they started to explore different technologies, materiality. Not to put you ever in a modern camp, just in a way of how radical that was from what then was used in a way. I think your material approach could be seen maybe that way.
Well, see, I've been very badly trained in the sense that the digital period we're talking about, I was told over and over again how marginal, irrelevant, and unsuccessful the computer would be in architecture. I mean, the number of people that said, nobody's ever going to use this stuff, you don't need it, it's making things needlessly complicated, it looks ugly. I mean, and then literally less than a decade, it's industry standard. So I've given up on predicting the future and trying to figure out what influence things might have. I just try to do where my instinct takes me. It could be totally irrelevant, could have nothing to do with architecture, it could have everything to do with some other field, I don't know. It's just my nose is telling me this is where the action is, and so I'm interested in stuff that moves. You know, will it be, will it take over as much as digital technology did? Probably not. But if you would have asked me 20 years ago about digital technology, I would have said it was a marginal, idiosyncratic, niche interest. But it's funny how it turned into so much more than that.
Yes, it was in the State of the Union address last year.
You hear me being quiet.
Yeah,
Yes, what's going
I
on
want to
here?
hear you, Peter. I want you to respond. That was pretty good.
First of all, Greg knows how I feel about buildings that move, literally.
Yep.
I mean, because you've taken away the virtual nature of movement. And to me, to literalize movement is the next step to literalizing all of what one considers the possibility of the virtual in architecture.
You still use literal transparency.
No.
Even though you have notational transparency, you can still see through things.
Yeah, you can see through things, yeah, but
I think
the
so that
notion, look,
literally
you showed
moves
me the
will
house,
animate
that,
the rest of the
the
stage
house,
more.
Greg, the house for me that rotates is to me, where you have to be like a rat in a maze.
No.
I'm not sure.
It's,
That's all.
no, it should, making it a house was an accident of circumstance. It really should be a piece of a room. That's the idea. It's not that you'd be in a ball that rolls around your whole life. But
You showed it as a house.
I know. So,
That was a
but
mistake. Okay.
it's recent.
Let him off on that.
Yeah.
Let's hypothesize with him for a
Yes.
minute. Hypothesize with Greg that part of it could move.
Anyway.
But
I think-
Peter doesn't want anything to be literally doing what it does. It was always
Never.
it was always a mental construct. For you, the whole idea of an architecture, the mental construct, Greg, does not seem to be of interest. Am I right?
No, that's
The idea
not-
of reading?
No, that's
No, I
not-
don't think for Greg that's interesting.
No, it is interesting, sorry.
Not for him, not for Greg.
Oh, yeah.
What I love
I don't
and
see
admire
it.
about Peter is his optimism in the intelligence of the people that occupy his buildings. And I have to say I've become a little more cynical about somebody's ability to read in depth. And I think that's just the state of affairs. Because, I mean, we don't even have an architecture critic in major newspapers and stuff.
Yeah. Greg,
They're
Greg.
so
if-
it's, I think the general
Yeah,
level
wait.
of legibility is probably, you know, I don't feel like I would be addressing to the degree of intellect that Peter is trying to address the legibility of
But
his
you're
building.
Wait a
interested in the
minute.
margins too.
No, wait a minute. I'm saying is Marcel Proust, if he took your attitude, would never have written Remembrance of Things Past. Because his friends would say, nobody's going to understand anything about this. And yet
But
Marcel
that's why we
Proust...
have Michel Houellebecq instead of Marcel Proust. It's
What?
still interesting literature, it's for a different audience.
You can, the question is whether it is interesting literature or not. That's...
Houellebecq is.
What?
No, Houellebecq is. It's more part of it.
Oh,
Look, I'm not saying there's a zeitgeist, but
Yeah,
there's
but
definitely
I'm a big Houellebecq fan, so, you know, that's not the issue. He's not for everyone, and it's no different than Proust. But the idea of buildings moving is not Houellebecq.
No, all I'm saying is that Houellebecq's writing for a different kind of audience than Proust. And I think that is...
No
that's
kidding.
Well, that's because Houellebecq's writing now.
That's
I mean,
right.
So, I think...
But I
it's
mean,
just
what about someone like Pynchon, if we want to get literary, who was writing for somebody in the 60s, the 70s, and who's writing today, and it's still relevant today?
Well, I mean, that would be your... Yeah.
Yeah. I mean...
Pynchon's writing from the 90s. But even if he writes now, I mean, Pynchon's... You know,
Pynchon
yeah.
is writing the same thing he was writing 50 years ago. To me,
Yeah,
I
just like-
admire the capacity of an individual to stick with a project for 50 years and still be relevant. I don't know any architect that's been able to do that except Le Corbusier. Yet.
He never changed his mind.
He didn't change his mind, but he didn't stay relevant. I think, when the Corbu show opened, Greg, I said to Richard Meyer, in 50 years, do you think they could mount a show of your work like this? And fortunately, he was very honest and said no. And I don't believe that there are many architects that a show could be mounted 50 years from now that would equal the Corbu show. And I would say the same thing about Pynchon's project of 50 years, probably cannot be duplicated by many writers today.
Yeah. Well, look, I think Corbu stayed in flux. I mean, to say Corbu, you know, the 5 points, I don't know if you can still find the 5 points in Lake Corb. I've never tried, but I know there's extra points by the time you're into the Brutalist Corb and Lake Corb. I mean, the diversity in the work is pretty impressive. I mean, I think it would have been easy for you to still be doing House 1. I think it's, what I like retrospectively is seeing the early work, seeing the palimpsest work, seeing the early digital work, seeing the late digital work, and then, you know, with your most recent work, even a retrospective glance to go back and pull some of the early stuff back in, to pull the palimpsest back into the digital stuff. I mean, that's what I like about Corb, and that's what's maybe not so likable about Mies for me.
Right.
I mean, I was never into Mies because it all seemed too much a project of refinement, you know, rather than a project of exploration and creativity, you know. So Corb was always open. I mean, open to South America, open to Africa, open to all kinds of influences. I mean, that work is interesting for its diversity rather than its focus.
Do you think
for
that
me.
Corbu was conscious of trying to stay relevant? I would argue no. He was, he's doing what you're doing, following his nose. You're not trying to stay relevant. You're trying to follow your nose. It may happen to be that you stay relevant.
Yeah.
It also may be that you won't.
Yeah. No.
That's a risk.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Corb's paintings in the buff down in southern France are probably not so relevant. Believe me, I worry. You don't want to be that guy.
You should. We all do. You
Yeah.
just have a longer time to worry about it than I do.
Well, we'll see.
Anyway,
Should we take questions?
And any questions in the audience for Greg? No, we're done. We've been here for 10 hours, Greg. Wait.
Okay,
Who is this guy?
you gotta come up here.
You gotta come.
We got a question for you.
By the way, I want you to know this is the first time I've ever done a Skype thing like this in public. It's nice that I'm doing it with you.
Yeah, it's great. You're doing well. Here's a young person,
Hello.
a Serbian.
No, I'm a Greek
He's a Greek.
from the University of Patras. And I would like to stress out the difference between choice and decision. That's being discussed in a book called Computer Power and Human Reason by Joseph Weizenbaum, who is a mentor of artificial intelligence. And he says that choice is something that needs responsibility, whether a decision is only a sequence of facts. And in this discussion of closed systems of architectural intelligence, to me it's like a game of discussion with an idol in front of a mirror. And I would like to question that when this ontological game becomes, there's an ecstasy of this ontological game and we get lost. I think that's rather well being put out in the title Scientific Autobiography by Rossi. And when artificial intelligence and the closed systems become monumental and very serious, doesn't that question man's autonomy? And that's actually the difference that man has with the physical world. It's his power to make his own rules.
Well, I know even among people on this panel, I remember at the INI conference when I showed the embryological houses and Peter said, how do you pick the best one? And I said, no, the thing is to design all 50,000 at once, like they're all perfect. And he said, that's impossible. The focus was really not the one, but the focus was the capacity of the tool to let me be a new kind of designer or new kind of author. So if you look at those and you think that you got to pick one and that the task is really one of, making some kind of abstract system and then picking within it, which is really, that sounds like the 90s to me. Your question sounds very 20 years old. Honestly, I'm sorry. Then you have a different attitude than if you say, well, how is this a different kind of tool? How is it different than a May line? Like, I'm sure people were really upset about straight lines when everybody started using May lines, but people found a new way to create fluid space with May lines, like Mies. So I think it's the same thing. It's not really an autonomous system with limits that you're then forced to pick within. I think it's just rethinking your medium. So, design and decision never left the game ever for me. It was always on the table. It's just different. It's a different kind of decision when you've got a digital tool than when you don't.
Yeah, that's actually the same question what we could say about abstract geometry. It's also a closed system. Or Le Corbusier's horizon that we were talking today.
But it's, when Peter says that the objects were less legible, or that the ambition was to make objects more difficult to be legible, if you ask the minimalists, they say they're trying to do the same thing. I think no architect wants to make something which is obvious or legible. I don't think so. The question is just what's the medium you're going to use to do that, and how do you make critical evaluations within it? But I don't think there's anything inherently alienating about the digital. In the 90s, that's what everybody said. This is really alienating. Todd Williams and Billy Tien said, we'll never use a computer, it's too alienating. We only use pencils. But they use computers now. I don't think they seem alienated.
The question is if they use computers as a design tool or as a production tool. I mean, I'm not convinced that people that you're citing use the computer as a design tool in its full.
But they're certainly not on the cutting edge. I think what's more interesting is to ask, is somebody like Achim Menges, who I consider to be at the cutting edge, is he using the computer as a production tool or a design tool? And I think that's something Achim would have to answer. But I do think
Let's forget the word
digital.
Design and say conceptual tool. I'd rather not say design tool. I don't believe that Menges is using it as a conceptual tool, maybe as a design tool, but I don't think he's involved at all in the conceptual world. That's
Well, he's got to answer that.
What?
He's got to answer.
No, you have to
I think it's
answer
a
that
good
because
question to
that's
ask.
what's on the table.
You can read it yourself.
That's on the table, Greg, whether we're talking kind of concept design or production.
Going back to that, if he has to answer, you're back in the old authorial will and
Right.
the author controls the word. That's really old stuff. It's not about what the author thinks.
No, at all.
I mean, why do you care so much about what he thinks? Achim or any other architect thinks of their own
Achim,
work. That's
that's-
not the
Achim-
interpretive. That's not the interpretive authority of their work.
No. I just mean Achim's a really smart guy.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious for him where he focuses his intelligence. If it's on the possibilities of production, or if it's on the reception, if more on the cultural intellectual reception of the work. Because look, I could read Achim's work so that it's very involved in the conceptualizations of space. But what he talks about more often, it might be just who he hangs out with, he talks more about production. But I do see a generational shift from digital concepts to digital manufacture and fabrication, and stuff that I consider to be a little more vocational.
Yeah.
But Achim, as you said, is indeed a smart guy because he goes all the span that you mentioned. It is conceptual, design, and fabrication, but mostly of highly sophisticated experimental technical objects.
Right.
Yep.
It's about, as we were saying earlier today, it's about mostly the philosophy of engineering. It's about how material works. And what Peter was preoccupied about earlier today is that in these technical objects, there's no architectural space, which in the case of Achim Menges is inevitably true.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're huts. They're primitive huts. Most of the stuff,
Yeah.
the biannual things are huts.
Or skin.
No, that's a problem. The whole pavilion thing is a problem.
The what thing?
The pavilion.
The pavilion, the PS1
yeah.
generation thing.
All this stuff
we can blame a
produces-
lot of that on PS1.
It's not,
Yeah.
None of it makes a program.
Yep.
I think
Decorative.
somehow
Decorative program.
we need to close before
Yeah.
everybody else is. Greg, thank you very much.
I'm really
See you
sorry.
soon. Do we just get stuck here, or how do we get off the stage?
Ciao, Greg, thanks.
There's no authority here anymore. The authority
Yeah,
is
they left. Yeah, they all left.
the authority's
We
gone.
need help, guidance.
That was good.